While the world remembers Stalingrad, a simultaneous battle just 140 miles from Moscow consumed over 2 million casualties in a year-long meat grinder so catastrophic that Soviet historians spent decades erasing it from history. And when it finally ended, the Germans simply walked away. This is the story of the Rzhev Salient, where Stalin's obsession met Model's fanaticism, where entire armies vanished into frozen mud, and where victory meant inheriting a wasteland of corpses and ash. For over a year, from January 1942 to March 1943, this forgotten battlefield devoured more Soviet lives than Stalingrad itself. Yet, you have probably never heard of it. That silence was deliberate. In January 1942, a German dagger pointed at Moscow's heart, and Stalin would spend a year and over 1 million lives trying to remove it. When the Soviet winter counteroffensive drove German forces back from Moscow in late 1941, it created a massive bulge in the front line. The Wehrmacht retreated over 100 miles, but they did not collapse. Instead, they dug in, forming a salient that jutted toward the Soviet capital like a clenched fist. At its apex sat the city of Rzhev, just 140 miles from Moscow, close enough to threaten, close enough to humiliate. For Stalin, this proximity was intolerable. The German presence at Rzhev meant the Battle of Moscow remained unfinished. Enemy forces still stood within striking distance of the capital, tying down massive Soviet resources and casting a shadow over the winter victory. What should have been a tactical problem became a personal obsession. Stalin ordered the salient eliminated at any cost. That cost would prove astronomical. Throughout 1942 and into 1943, Stalin launched wave after wave of offensives against the Rzhev Bulge. The Soviet General Staff committed entire fronts to the task. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers poured into the salient's killing grounds. The strategic logic was simple: destroy the German forces, secure the approaches to Moscow, finish what the winter offensive had started. But simplicity in planning became catastrophe in execution. The political dimension made retreat impossible. Stalin could not allow German forces to remain so close to Moscow. Every day the salient existed reminded the Soviet people that the enemy still threatened their capital. So the offensives continued, each one bleeding the Red Army white, each one failing to achieve breakthrough. The proximity to Moscow had created a trap, but not for the Germans. Soviet forces found themselves locked in a death spiral, compelled to assault increasingly fortified positions regardless of losses. The hammer would keep falling until either the anvil broke or the hammer shattered. But Stalin's hammer would meet an immovable object, a German general who would transform this salient into the most fortified killing ground on the Eastern Front. Against Stalin's endless waves of men, Model built a fortress that would consume them by the hundreds of thousands. General Walter Model earned his nickname the Führer's Fireman by stabilizing collapsing fronts through tactical genius and ruthless efficiency. When he took command of the German Ninth Army at Rzhev, he transformed the salient into what Wehrmacht commanders called the cornerstone of the Eastern Front. Model understood that static defense would fail. Instead, he created layered killing zones, deep bunkers reinforced with logs and steel, minefields so dense that Soviet soldiers were ordered to clear them by walking through them, interlocking fields of machine gun fire that turned every approach into a death trap, artillery registration zones that allowed German gunners to rain shells on attacking formations within seconds. the fortifications exploited every advantage of terrain. Forests channeled Soviet attacks into predetermined kill zones. Swamps protected flanks. Rivers became moats. Every strong point supported its neighbors. Every position had fallback lines. Model's defensive philosophy created a fortress without walls, a maze of death that swallowed Soviet armies whole. Stalin's response was to throw more men at the problem. In November 1942, while the world watched Stalingrad, the Soviets launched Operation Mars. The offensive committed between 9 and 11 rifle corps, supported by tank corps and cavalry divisions. Over 40 divisions smashed against Model's defenses. The Soviet objective was encirclement and annihilation of the German Ninth Army. The result was catastrophe. Operation Mars achieved nothing except slaughter. Soviet casualties reached between 335,000 and 400,000 men. At least 70,000 died. 4 entire Soviet corps were destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. German losses totaled approximately 40,000. The casualty ratio was nearly 10-1. While Operation Uranus at Stalingrad encircled the German Sixth Army and changed the course of the war, Operation Mars simply fed more bodies into the meat grinder. The landscape itself became an abomination. Artillery transformed forests into fields of splintered stumps. Craters pocked every meter of ground, trenches filled with mud, blood, and corpses. The density of dead was such that attacking soldiers advanced over piles of bodies. Veterans recalled using frozen corpses as cover during winter assaults. The smell of death hung over everything, thick enough to taste. Soviet penal battalions composed of convicted soldiers and political prisoners received the most suicidal missions. They cleared minefields by walking through them. They assaulted fortified bunkers with minimal support. Casualty rates in these units reached 70-90% in single operations. This horror repeated for an entire year. The Rzhev battles consumed between 1.3 and 1.6 million Soviet casualties compared to German losses of 300,000 to 400,000. The casualty ratio made Rzhev more costly for the Soviets than Stalingrad. Yet while Stalingrad became legend, Rzhev remained unknown. Yet while this unprecedented slaughter unfolded, the world heard nothing, because the Soviets were systematically erasing it from history. After a year of unprecedented slaughter, the Soviets finally broke through, only to find the Germans had already left. Soviet historiography under Stalin buried the Rzhev battles in silence. Official histories omitted details. Casualty figures disappeared. Operation Mars, the costliest failure, vanished almost completely from the record. Georgy Zhukov, the celebrated marshal who planned Mars, barely mentioned it in his memoirs despite his central role. The contrast with Stalingrad was deliberate. While Stalingrad symbolized Soviet sacrifice and ultimate triumph, Rzhev represented failure and waste on a scale that undermined the regime's narrative. So Rzhev was erased. Western historians, reliant on Soviet sources, followed suit. For decades, the battles remained obscure. Only after 1991, when Soviet archives opened, did the full scale of the disaster emerge. Researchers like David Glantz pieced together the truth from military records, casualty reports, and survivor testimony. The world finally learned what Stalin had hidden: over 2 million casualties in a year-long battle that achieved nothing strategic. But the final insult came in March 1943. The Germans decided to abandon the salient. Operation Buffel, executed between March 1 and March 22nd, evacuated the entire German Ninth Army, approximately 350,000 troops, in an orderly withdrawal with minimal casualties. The tactical rationale was clear. After the disaster at Stalingrad, German forces were stretched thin across the Eastern Front. The Rzhev Salient tied down divisions that could be used elsewhere. The line needed shortening. The salient had served its purpose as a shield and a distraction. Now it was expendable. The Germans did not simply retreat. They implemented systematic scorched earth devastation. Approximately 40,000 buildings were destroyed, wells were poisoned, roads and bridges were mined with booby traps. Infrastructure was demolished. Between 30 and 50,000 civilians were forcibly deported to Germany for slave labor. The retreating Wehrmacht left behind a deliberate wasteland. When Soviet forces finally occupied Rzhev, they found empty ruins, no enemy to defeat, no victory to claim, just ash and corpses. The Soviets had lost over 1.5 million casualties for a position the enemy voluntarily abandoned. Stalin's obsession had purchased a graveyard. The Pyrrhic nature of this liberation made the cover-up even more necessary. How could the regime celebrate recapturing ruins that cost more lives than Stalingrad? How could Zhukov's reputation survive the revelation that his greatest offensive achieved nothing? So the silence deepened. Monuments were not built. Veterans were not celebrated. Families received no answers about sons and fathers who vanished into the Rzhev meat grinder. Modern Russian and German historians now assess Rzhev as epic, tragic, and largely futile. The current consensus is brutal in its clarity. Neither side achieved lasting strategic advantage proportionate to the losses suffered. The salient tied down forces on both sides, but the cost in human life was disproportionate to any military benefit. For the Soviets especially, Rzhev stands as a symbol of Stalin's willingness to accept any casualty rate in pursuit of objectives driven more by ego than strategy. The story of Rzhev asks a haunting question. How many other forgotten meat grinders lie buried in the archives of history? The Rzhev Salient stands as history's most forgotten catastrophe. For over a year, Stalin's obsession and Model's fanaticism consumed more than 2 million casualties in pointless attrition. The fighting was as brutal as any on the Eastern Front. The losses exceeded Stalingrad. The tactical sophistication of German defenses met the grinding persistence of Soviet offensives in a collision that obliterated armies. Yet the final outcome mocked the sacrifice. The Soviets achieved a Pyrrhic victory when the Germans simply walked away, executing a planned withdrawal that rendered the entire year of slaughter meaningless. The catastrophe was so complete that it took half a century and the fall of the Soviet Union for the world to even learn it happened. Rzhev reveals uncomfortable truths about the Eastern Front. It demonstrates that not all Soviet offensives were brilliant operations. It shows that German defensive skill could inflict staggering casualties even when strategically doomed. It proves that political obsession can transform tactical problems into human disasters. Most importantly, it reminds us that the famous battles we remember often eclipse equally significant campaigns lost to deliberate historical amnesia. The soldiers who died at Rzhev deserved better than silence. Their sacrifice deserved acknowledgement, not erasure. The families who lost sons and fathers deserved truth, not propaganda. Instead, they received decades of official forgetting, their suffering deemed inconvenient to the state narrative of inevitable Soviet triumph. Today, the Rzhev Memorial to the Soviet soldier stands on the old battlefield. Erected only in 2020, it represents belated recognition of a forgotten slaughter, but recognition cannot resurrect the dead or restore the lost years of silence. The memorial asks visitors to remember what the Soviet state worked so hard to forget, that victory's price can be so high it becomes indistinguishable from defeat, and that some battles are remembered not for what they achieved, but for what they reveal about the terrible mathematics of attrition warfare and the human cost of strategic obsession. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.